Okay, this is a brief overview of research proposals to prepare for paper number 2, research proposal assignment. Okay, so what's the proposal for? The proposal is a statement of intent about your research as it explores the topic, introduces your research question and hypothesis, and states what methods you would use to answer your questions. So you need to make the case for why this topic needs to be studied. The writer needs to convey their intent in the research, their justification for the study, as well as the methods which explain how you're actually going to go about studying your topic, such as saying, oh, I'm going to conduct qualitative, semi-structured interviews with nurses, or some specific way you will do the research. So the research proposal is a small step in the research paper process. This is not just an exercise for this class, it's part of the process for professional researchers who need to have their proposals approved before they can conduct the research that the methods section outlines. Sometimes this involves getting money to do the research, so it needs to be a paper that communicates the need to do the research on a particular topic. So when it comes to the literature review section of your research proposal, at least for this assignment, it should reference at least 5 peer-reviewed academic sources for this paper submission. The way this works is you will organize the research by topic and explore how their findings relate to your topic. So we'll go over literature reviews more in depth later, as I will go over, it with the additional readings as well in a moment. But I want to make this as clear as possible. If your literature review is paragraph 1, article 1, paragraph 2, article 2, paragraph 3, article 3, then you're not actually writing a literature review. You may not actually be analyzing or synthesizing the research. You may just be summarizing, which means you're not leading it with your voice or using that citation sandwich that we explored, where you set up your point, right, which is the first piece of bread, back it up with data, which is the veggie meat in the middle, and then reiterate or connect your example with the other slice of bread, right? So let's say I'm writing a paper about student success in a sociology writing course, hypothetically. I can say something like, quote, students benefit from writing multiple paper drafts. According to UC Berkeley's writing program, writing multiple paper drafts ensures students work on the assignments over time and not at the last minute, which results in better papers. With this in mind, I recommend students spend time working on multiple paper drafts as it will benefit their overall grade in a sociology writing course. Okay, so that's my example. So I set it up with my argument that students can benefit. Then I use data from a reliable source to convey that information in my words, while also accurately summarizing their argument. Then I convey its connection to why I'm mentioning it in my paper, based on its connection to my topic. So again, let me be clear. You need to explain the findings in your words, how they connect back to your points. If you're just summarizing, your point is gone. It sounds like a few blurbs about someone's research glued together, and I'm left to sort out what they mean, how they're connected, and I'm left unclear as to why you chose those articles or arguments. So make sure you're focusing on what's important from the source, not all the extra crap that does not matter to the context of your paper. So let's use that same sentence example from before. Instead, this time, I do not lead with the sentence setting it up. I just jump right in and hope it makes sense when it does not. So instead, my paragraph just starts with, quote, according to UC Berkeley's writing program, titled, quote, why assign multiple drafts, end quote, from the spring of 2000, originally published in volume 1, number 1 by Jane Hammonds, and then I just use a long-ass quote instead of using my own words. When students are required to write drafts, they begin thinking about an assignment well in advance of the due date. This not only prevents procrastination, it also gives students an opportunity to display early thinking. So then I just leave it at the end of the quote and don't explain it and move on, which is the wrong way to do it. I hope you can see the difference there. I didn't set it up, then I used a long quote that's vague and interpretable. And again, when I didn't set it up, I just used a whole bunch of crap words of like, I gave you what the title was, the author was, where it was from, what year it was in. Like, none of those things are relevant, right? Give me one of those things. Either the author's name, like, oftentimes the title is way too long and slows down the context of your paper, but people will just pop them in there because they're used to just giving me a long ass summary of something, of like taking an article and basically just like cutting out a few sentences and giving me exactly what they said in the whole damn thing, which is not what is appropriate to a literature review, right? So in that example that I gave, I didn't add a sentence to contextualize the information like I did in the previous example. So if you just hear the quote out of context, you may think that my point is about students displaying early thinking, when what I'm really looking at is student success in a sociology writing course. So to contrast that, let me read back that previous example again. Quote, students benefit from writing multiple paper drafts. According to UC Berkeley's writing program, writing multiple paper drafts ensures students work on assignments over time and not at the last minute, which results in better papers. With this in mind, I recommend students spend time working on multiple paper drafts as it will benefit their overall grade in a sociology writing course. So circling back, this shows my voice leading the information, connecting it back to my paper topic. So this is what I expect you to do in your paper's literature review. In this submission and in future paper submissions, you should be spending time refining your arguments and making them clear and succinct, and not relying or over-relying on quotes to convey your point for you. Even if you use a quote, you need to explain it yourself as well. So oftentimes, it's better, instead of using a quote, to paraphrase, because it's going to fit the context of your writing style. It's not going to sound like crazy stuffy and out of place, right? You need to explain it yourself instead. So the guidelines specific for paper number 2 research proposal can be found on Canvas, but let me go over that super in brief as well right now. Okay, so here's the assignment sheet. It gives you a little blurb on why you're doing this. Here's your instructions. I break it down by section, what I'm looking for in each section, right? So in the intro, you should be stating the problem your research is addressing. You want to provide a succinct picture of your arguments and set the stage for why this is important, right? So you also want to end the section with your research question, right? So you're basically setting it up like, this is an important topic. Here's the kind of scope of it. In this paper, I want to examine the ways in which X, Y, and Z, right? Then that transitions to the literature review section. So that section of the proposal should have at least 5 peer-reviewed sources, as I said before. So these are theories, concepts, and researchers that give context to the previous research done on your topic. And again, this is not a glorified annotated bibliography. Annotated bibs are when you just kind of like copy and paste someone else's crap into a list. Like, that's not what this is. That might be the first step in making your literature review, is making a little annotated bib for yourself, but it's filling it in. It's explaining it in your own words, which is what's going to be much more effective, right? So this section can be broken down by subcategories, grouped concepts, if applicable to your topic, right? So the example I gave here is if you were looking at causes of poverty and you were doing similar research into categories such as, grouping social structure, social class, gender, race, or different subcategories that have relationships with causes of poverty, it helps you organize those research findings that you get from the peer-reviewed articles, because you're sorting them based on the topic and not like paragraph 1, article 1, paragraph 2, article 2, right? You want them to actually, sometimes you're going to have 2 or 3 citations in one paragraph. Sometimes you're only going to have 1 in a paragraph, right? But the idea is if your whole format is like 1 paragraph, 1 article, next paragraph, next article, you're not actually synthesizing them or connecting them together. So that, again, comes from doing multiple drafts of the paper and crafting a more effective argument. So remember, this is a basic version of a lit review that will be expanded upon for your next writing assignment. And when I say basic version, that doesn't mean don't do it or it's bullet points or anything like that. Like, this should be a full paper submission, as if you were handing to IRB a thing that says, hey, I want you to pay for me to do research, right? That's kind of what a proposal is. It has to be formalized. It has to be effective. It can't just have huge grammatical problems or huge sentence structure issues. It's got to be an effective argument, right? But again, you are going to add to this each time you submit the paper, right? So for paper number 3, the literature review, you're just going to add 5 more peer-reviewed sources to the paper that you turn in for your proposal, right? So if you want to add more than 5 at this point, that's fine, because eventually you're going to have to get to 10. But at this point, all I'm like looking for is a checklist and checking off on is that you have 5, right? I suggest you have a small introduction to your literature review. And this could literally be like 2 sentences and say like, in the following section, I will explore the ways in which poverty is, correlates with gender, race, and sexuality, or whatever it is, right? Whatever it is your paper's actually looking at. Sometimes it's really effective to set up those concepts or subheadings at the top. Then you have a subheading, and you only have to do transitions between subheadings instead of between every paragraph to make it sound better, right? So at the end of your lit review, you're going to want to pop in your hypothesis or reaffirmation of your hypothesis to kind of connect back all the research you've been exploring as to what the hell does that have to do with your paper, right? And then in your methods, you're going to obviously talk about what you're going to do in your research, right? So you can't say, I'm going to look at statistics. It's like, what the hell does that mean? Or I'm going to review previous studies. Well, that's for your lit review. What are you going to do, right? What research would you do as the researcher to answer this question, right? So it could be, I'm going to make a survey. I'm going to do interviews. I'm going to look at existing data sources like the census. I'm going to download a data set from Pew Research Center and do a two-tailed ANOVA or whatever the crap, right? There is no right or wrong. It's just how do you fit a method to answer your question. So if my question's like, what are people's feelings and experiences about something, sometimes it's hard to get at feelings and experiences through quantitative methods. You would probably want to do an interview in qualitative. If I was looking at like, how many people are facing a particular issue, then a survey makes more sense. So it really is just about how you're framing your question as to what methods make sense to fit. And I will help you with this. And if you have any questions with this, let me know. I'm, a nerd and I like trying to find these different ways. But again, just remember, there's no right or wrong for these things. I could give everyone the same topic and they could all take a completely different methods approach to it. And they would be right as long as they explain, this is why I think this will answer my question. And here's the limitations of that approach, right? Okay, so, and remember, every approach you choose will have limitations. It's not a bad thing. It's just being mindful of those things, right? Like if you do a survey, it might not get at more in-depth understandings because sometimes people feel limited by the choices of like strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, or things like that on a Likert scale. While on the flip side of that, if you did interviews, you can say, okay, I got at those meetings, but that doesn't mean that it reflects the larger population that a survey could cover, right? So no matter what you choose, there's going to be a limitation. That's not a problem. It's just being mindful of that, right? Okay, so you're not actually doing the research. I just want to be as clear about that as possible too. Like you're going to say, I'm going to interview 12 people. You don't actually have to like find 12 people to interview. This is hypothetical. And the reason I'm making you do this is so that you get an idea of how research is constructed and how you go about planning it from the beginning to the end. Always has to have in mind how you're going to answer that question. But again, you don't have like infinite time in this class and I'm not going to try and torture you by making you do that. So we'll talk later about how the conclusion section will be different and how the research paper overall is not going to have a findings or discussion section because you didn't actually do the research, right? But we will still have a full method section that explains how you're going to go about this stuff, right? As if it were really happening. Okay, so let's see here. So why is it a good one? You're like, well, I'm looking for people's in-depth experiences, so I'm interviewing, right? Anyway. Okay, and then the conclusion section just needs to quickly wrap up the paper's main points and reiterate the importance or scope. So again, you don't want to just like restate the intro all over again. You want to kind of guide it towards, hey, reiterate this is important, reiterate this should be studied, and why we should know more about this topic, right? And then there should be a reference page because you are citing 5 peer-reviewed sources, right? So the proposal should have a reference page that alphabetically lists sources you used in ASA format. So ASA is the American Sociological Association format. I will provide some resources on how to use that on Canvas as well. But another thing that's important is, because if you've used APA, it's very similar to ASA, so it's not that difficult a format. But I am going to look for those things, and you don't want to lose points on something stupid like that. Another part of it is having a hanging indent for each source. Another one of those tedious little things, but if you get these things right in like the proposal, the lit review draft, by the time you get to the final paper, you're not even worrying about any of that crap, right? So it's good to start trying to worry about this up top. Also, another point that I want to make is that the reference page should always start at the top of a fresh page. So let's say you only have like a paragraph at the end of your paper. You don't just slap the references on after that. You slap them on an additional page, right? It always starts at the top of a new page. And again, should be alphabetical. And hanging indent just means that it's actually kind of what this looks like, really. A hanging indent means that the beginning of the reference would start here, and then every line subsequently would be tabbed in. It's kind of a pain in the ass to do. Supposedly Word, if you just highlight it and do hanging indent, it works, but it most often does not work. You often have to go to the second line and go enter, enter, delete, enter, and it'll work. It's kind of a pain in the ass. But anyway, you're only having 10 sources total for the full paper, so it's not like, like my thesis research, which was like 100 sources, which is a huge pain in the ass. But anyway, the whole point is to get used to how these things are set up, right? Okay, so when it comes to the details, there's no specific length requirement for the assignment. It should be around 4 to 10 pages. So I'm not going to grade you down for that particularly. It's just the idea is I want to give you a kind of a range of what's expected, because remember, this is double spaced. If you can't come up with 2 pages single spaced, then like, wow, you're not writing a paper for this class. Versus a 10-page paper would be 5 pages single spaced. It's not that much, but that should be significant enough, right? At this stage in the paper. So, and again, if it's a little shorter, if it's a little longer, I don't want you to like BS stuff to throw it in there to make it longer. I don't want you to have to like take things that are good out of your paper to make it shorter. That's part of the revision process that'll happen from me when you submit this. Also, for when you submit your lit review, you'll get more revisions from me and from a peer reviewer in the class. So anyway, okay, so make sure that again, 12-point font, 5 whatever, and then you want to make sure it's like in that research paper format and that you turn it in on time. Right? So the total points possible, 50. All right, let's transition back. Okay, so as far as resources for this paper, I wanted to give you all the tools and instruction you need to succeed in writing your paper for this class. So here's a few of those resources to look into that will help with your proposal and make sure you're on the right track. So first, I provided a sample proposal on Canvas that is a previous student submission that got an A grade. So it's not perfect. It did not get 100%, but it can be a helpful idea of what you need to do for this paper submission in this class. Some people find samples to be helpful so they can reference it, but it should not stand in for the assignment sheet, right? The examples are not perfect, so you don't need to replicate them exactly. It's just an idea. So please look at the sources within that context. Also, there are helpful guides with explainers in your textbook. Please use this as a reference, right? This is why you have to buy this crap. So that's what it's for, right? Specifically, pages 22 through 24 talks about research proposals, and page 25 gives a sample one as well. So we also previously discussed proposals in week 3, so you can refer back to the chapter or lecture for designing your paper as another reference that will help provide clarity. Another great resource is Purdue OWL, or the Online Writing Lab, which has a lot of helpful resources, and it's a great place to find information and guides for writing your paper. But again, you want to still make sure you're doing it within the rules of our paper assignment, right? And then there are additional resources on Canvas that can help support you in your writing your paper, which I'm going to go over one of those in a moment here. Okay, so also I want to encourage you to use the Writing Center at school, either online or schedule an appointment with the Sociology Department writing tutor, who's a grad student, who will help you with revisions and format and all that fun stuff. And this is a great resource you get for free as a student, a resource you should take advantage of, whether it's, the Writing Center or the Sociology Department writing tutor. So contact me if you want any more information about these resources, or of course you can find it on the, school website. So you're also welcome to reach out to me with any questions or concerns that you have. So I just want to briefly touch upon chapter 5 and 6 of Writing Within Sociology that's part of the additional resources on Canvas. So in chapter 5, it's titled Lit Reviews for Applied Research. Again, I just want to touch upon a few things from these readings. So in chapter 5, they talk about the purposes of a literature review. which includes setting your problem within a context that will convince your readers that the issue you're addressing is an important one to study. It also involves setting up and describing your research questions that will guide your inquiry and examine the overall literature on a topic so you can provide a comprehensive analysis, right? And for identifying important variables and, that you're going to examine within your methods, those relationships between those variables. So they talk about why do we do proposals, right? It's to make sure we clarify and refine the scope of the research before we invest a bunch of time and money and energy into it. So they also say that good literature reviews should define a problem in its scope, ask one or more clear research questions, which again, you're going to set up in the section before that in your introduction. Obviously, it should examine the literature, which just means going through the kind of, accepted or known, concepts, topics, theories, paradigms, approaches within your particular topic, right? Or, the relationships between your chosen variables that's valid to the scope of your research. Also, it's to develop a model to explain the interactions between those variables. So this is a way more credible way than your opinion alone, right? To layer in all this previous research that illuminates the relationships between the variables. And again, lastly, a good literature review should propose the usefulness of the method and approach to the field of study. So in our case, how does your research help advance sociological knowledge and inquiry? So Chapter 5 also outlines some common writing problems in literature reviews, such as unclear scientific and practical purposes. And their suggested solution is to be more abstract about the issue, not vague or unclear, but appeal to the larger issue and its relevance. Also, they talked about items and ideas that are misplaced in the presentation, and their suggestion is to not place topics in the paper in the order they come up in your mind, but have a clear logical order that can help them with subheadings. And this is, again, why I made you do an outline ahead of time to help structure that. Also, if you separate sections, you want to make sure that they have, a unified scope for that section. So if there are sections that lack purpose with respect to the paper as a whole, their solution is to tell the readers directly how the section fits into the topic or scope of your paper. So that's a big one. You have to connect back with that second slice of the citation sandwich, right? Then they give some specific tips for good writing, such as write in an active voice, something we'll be discussing I think next week. I don't know which week it is anymore. Which is basically about being more direct in your writing and not using passive voice. Also, one of their specific tips for good writing is to develop a clear purpose for your paper. They say you need to be able to finish the sentence. The purpose of this paper is, right? Also, they suggest creating a title that clearly states what the paper's about, and using subheadings liberally in order to guide the reader through the paper. And of course, transitions are key to leading the reader from section to section to see how the sections in your paper are connected, right? Okay, real brief outline of Chapter 6 now. So this is, called What's Really Happening When I Write a Literature Review. So this chapter talks more about constructing the literature review and the actual article synthesis. So you need to look through previous research to identify key factors you might not have thought about at the beginning. And when you look at the topic more fully, you may see new relationships to explore. So this is why your paper is going to kind of constantly change as you adapt it in future drafts. So a key to researching for the literature review is finding and summarizing relevant information from research. When it comes to the specific resources, you need to be able to scan them pretty quickly for relevant info. So the chapter suggests you look at abstracts of articles, but also the intro, as that will lay out the overall argument and introduce the research questions, which help you determine if the article fits the scope of your literature reviews. Also, the author argues that while you read, you need to highlight and write down important ideas or questions that remind you of what the points are in the text, and to write a note to yourself about what purpose the article would serve in your paper. Similar to a method I always suggest, right? Where I know when I do research, what I love to do is I'll make a Google Doc, and I will basically just I'll find a good article, I'll cut and paste the abstract into a Google Doc, and then I'll label it with a one-word label for what section of my paper that should go in. Let's say gender section, I don't know, hypothetical, right? And then what I will do is write a 1 to 2 sentence summary of what is relevant from that source that I'm looking at, right? Like, 40% of people who face this issue experience this or whatever it is, so that I know exactly what I'm citing and why. And then when I go back to do my actual paper writing, it's so easy because this is already in a separate Google Doc, where also I'm a nerd, so I ASA cite them as I get them as well. Because the longer your papers get, the more citations you have, the easier it is to include things in the paper that aren't cited in the references, or include things in the references that aren't cited in the paper. You got to keep those things clear, right? As you change stuff in subsequent drafts. So I always love using this kind of extra Google Doc thing to kind of guide myself, because you read a bunch of articles for stuff, you're taking other classes, you have human lives, you can't keep all this information just like in your head and have it at a moment's notice when you have the 20 minutes to sit down and work on this paper, right? So it's good to kind of go through and summarize those things briefly as you go through, but instead of just copying and pasting the abstract, I always write like, okay, where would this fit in my paper? What's the label, right? Why is it important to my paper? Why am I going to use this? Oh, because it connects to how I'm trying to talk about this or whatever it is, which really helps me with that citation sandwich later on. So you need to sort out, also the chapter talks about sorting out different books and articles into logical groupings for your subtopics or your literature review. So this is, again, just seeing how they connect to each other oftentimes, right? And when the writing happens, summarizing the finding in each subtopic and review those specific articles that you're going through. You don't want to go too far into detail into a lot of the articles. Sometimes we give way too much information to each source. You want to add your explanation of a particular concept or relationship in your own words, often just giving me only the most necessary relevant information. And they end with a sample chunk of a literature review where the author outlines their purposes and motivations and how they constructed their literature review. So I suggest you review that briefly. It's in your additional resources, and the reason it's there is because students often struggle with constructing the literature review portion of their research proposal. So I want to make sure that you have those resources before the submission is due. Like I said before, we're going to go over literature reviews more in depth in the future as well before we get into the third paper, literature review assignment. But for now, you still need to know how to craft and how to write a literature review, but you are going to have the benefit of my feedback between this submission and the next submission. But that doesn't mean be lazy and not develop your arguments, right? This is why I provide these resources for you, so you can be successful. So please use these resources.